Mr. Peterson's shop, Peterson's Collectibles, wasn't exactly thriving. In fact, surviving might be a more accurate description. Nestled between a bustling bakery and a noisy auto repair shop, Peterson's Collectibles seemed to fade into the background, much like Mr. Peterson himself. Inside, dusty shelves groaned under the weight of forgotten treasures, chipped porcelain dolls, tarnished silver spoons, and stacks of old comic books that nobody seemed to want. Mr. Peterson, a man whose hairline was receding faster than his profits, shuffled through the aisles, a perpetual frown etched on his face. He'd inherited the store from his grandfather, a man with a knack for finding hidden gems. But Mr. Peterson, bless his heart, just didn't have the same touch. He tried, he really did. He'd spent hours scouring flea markets and estate sales, hoping to unearth that one item that would turn his luck around. But so far, nothing. The bills were piling up. The rent was overdue. And the bank was starting to send increasingly stern letters. Mr. Peterson had even taken out a second mortgage on his house, a decision that now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. He'd tried everything. Online ads, local newspaper promotions, even a wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man outside the store, which, admittedly, did attract some attention, but not the kind that led to sales. He'd even considered selling the store, but who would buy it? It was a money pit, plain and simple. He'd applied for loans, hoping to inject some much-needed capital into the business, but he was turned down time and time again. His credit score, once respectable, was now circling the drain. He glanced at the antique cash register, its numbers frozen at a paltry $12.50. That's all he'd made today. It wasn't enough to cover the electricity bill, let alone the rent. Despair gnawed at him. He felt trapped, cornered, like a rat in a maze with no escape. He slumped onto a rickety stool behind the counter, his head in his hands. He had a wife and daughter to support. What was he going to do? A dark thought flickered in his mind, a desperate idea born of desperation and fear. He quickly pushed it away, but it lingered, a seed of darkness planted in fertile ground. Something had to give. The night was unusually still, the air thick with the promise of rain. A lone street lamp flickered intermittently, casting long, dancing shadows across the deserted street. Inside Peterson's Collectibles, darkness reigned. The only sound was the gentle hum of the ancient refrigerator in the back room, a relic from Mr. Peterson's grandfather's time. Suddenly, a sharp crack shattered the silence, followed by a low rumble. A spark, tiny at first, erupted from an overloaded electrical outlet behind a shelf piled high with vintage board games. The spark danced along a frayed wire, igniting a nearby pile of dusty newspapers. Within seconds, flames began to lick at the dry paper, growing hungrily. The fire spread quickly, fueled by the shop's collection of flammable antiques and forgotten treasures. The old wooden shelves acted as kindling, sending flames spiraling towards the ceiling. Smoke billowed, filling the store with a thick, acrid haze. The heat intensified, melting plastic figurines and warping vinyl records. Outside, a dog began to bark, its frantic yelps cutting through the stillness of the night. A neighbor, roused from his sleep, peered out his window. He saw the orange glow emanating from Peterson's Collectibles and immediately dialed 911. Fire! Fire at Peterson's Collectibles, he shouted into the phone, his voice laced with panic. It looks bad. Really bad. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The first fire truck arrived, its flashing lights illuminating the street. Firefighters leaped from the truck, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. Flames were now shooting out of the windows, and thick black smoke poured from the roof. "This is a bad one," the fire chief muttered, his voice barely audible above the roar of the flames. "Get the hoses. We need to contain this before it spreads to the neighboring buildings." Firefighters battled the blaze for hours, their efforts hampered by the store's cluttered interior and the intense heat. The fire raged, consuming everything in its path. By the time it was finally extinguished, Peterson's Collectibles was a smoldering ruin, a blackened shell of its former self. The air hung heavy with the smell of smoke and charred wood, a testament to the destructive power of the fire. Mr. Peterson's worst nightmare had come true, in the most devastating way imaginable. The morning after the fire dawned gray and somber, mirroring the mood in the small town. The charred remains of Peterson's Collectibles stood as a stark reminder of the previous night's devastation. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, fluttering in the breeze like mournful flags. Detective Harding arrived on the scene, his trench coat collar pulled high against the chill. He was a man of few words, his face etched with years of experience. His eyes, however, were sharp and observant, missing nothing. Harding had seen it all in his 20 years on the force: petty theft, domestic disputes, even the occasional murder. He possessed a quiet intensity, a sense that he was always thinking, always piecing together the puzzle. He surveyed the scene, taking in the extent of the damage. The fire had been thorough, leaving little more than ashes and twisted metal. He approached the fire chief, a burly man with soot-stained cheeks. "Morning, Chief," Harding said, his voice gravelly. "What have we got?" "Looks like an electrical fire," the chief replied, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Old wiring, overloaded circuits. Happens all the time in these old buildings." "That's the initial assessment," Harding said, his gaze fixed on a particularly charred section of wall. "But I want a thorough investigation. I want to know exactly what happened here." The fire chief nodded. "We're already on it. Forensics team is on their way. They'll sift through the debris, look for any signs of foul play." Harding walked slowly around the perimeter of the building, his eyes scanning the ground. He noticed the way the fire had spread, the patterns it had left behind. Something didn't quite add up. He crouched down, examining a patch of scorched earth. "Chief," he called out. "Did you notice anything unusual about the burn patterns?" The fire chief joined him, his expression thoughtful. "Now that you mention it," he said, "there were a couple of spots where the fire seemed to burn hotter, faster than it should have. Almost like an accelerant was used." Harding finished the sentence, his eyes narrowing. The fire chief hesitated. "It's too early to say for sure," he said. "But it's a possibility." Harding stood up, his gaze fixed on the blackened facade of Peterson's Collectibles. "Then let's treat it as such," he said. "I want every inch of this place examined. If there's something here, I want to find it." He knew in his gut that this wasn't just a simple electrical fire. Something was off, and Detective Harding was determined to find out what. The forensics team meticulously combed through the debris, their white suits a stark contrast to the blackened surroundings. They carefully collected samples, placing them in sterile containers, each labeled with painstaking precision. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the acrid odor of chemicals. Meanwhile, Detective Harding spoke with the fire chief again, pressing him for more details about the initial response. "How long did it take to get the fire under control?" he asked. "A little over 2 hours," the chief replied. "It was a tough one. The store was packed with so much flammable material, it was like a tinderbox." "And the point of origin?" Harding inquired. "Appears to be in the back, near the electrical panel," the chief said. "But like I said, those burn patterns are odd." Harding nodded, his mind already piecing together the puzzle. He watched as the forensics team worked, their movements slow and deliberate. He knew that the smallest detail could be the key to unlocking the truth. A stray drop of gasoline, a misplaced object, anything could provide a clue. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the ruined landscape. The forensics team finally wrapped up their work, packing their equipment into their van. "We'll have a report for you within 24 hours, Detective," the team leader said. "We'll analyze the samples and let you know if we find any traces of accelerants." Harding thanked them and turned his attention back to the scene. He walked around the perimeter one more time, his eyes scanning every inch of the ground. He stopped in front of a pile of charred debris that had once been a display case. He crouched down, sifting through the ashes with his gloved hand. Suddenly, he stopped. He picked up a small, metallic object, its surface blackened and warped. It was a toy car, a vintage model from the 1950s. He turned it over in his hand, examining it closely. "Chief," he called out. "Take a look at this." The fire chief came over, his expression curious. He examined the toy car, his brow furrowing. "What about it?" he asked. "Notice how the paint is bubbled and blistered on one side," Harding said. "That's not consistent with the rest of the damage. It looks like it was exposed to intense heat for a prolonged period of time." The fire chief nodded slowly. "You think it was deliberately placed there?" "I don't know," Harding said. "But it's something to consider." He placed the toy car in a plastic bag and labeled it as evidence. He had a feeling that this small, seemingly insignificant object could be an important piece of the puzzle. The investigation was far from over, and Detective Harding was just getting started. Later that afternoon, Detective Harding paid a visit to Mr. Peterson's home. It was a modest, two-story house with a neatly manicured lawn. A swing set stood in the backyard, a testament to a life that, until recently, had seemed ordinary. Mr. Peterson answered the door, his face pale and drawn. He wore a rumpled bathrobe and his eyes were red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept. "Detective Harding," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "What can I do for you?" "I'm here to ask you a few questions about the fire, Mr. Peterson," Harding replied, his tone neutral. Peterson stepped aside, allowing Harding to enter. The house was surprisingly tidy, despite the circumstances. Photos of a smiling woman and a young girl adorned the walls. A half-finished puzzle lay on the coffee table. "Please, sit down," Peterson said, gesturing towards a worn armchair. Harding sat down, pulling out his notepad and pen. "First of all, Mr. Peterson, I want to express my condolences for your loss." Peterson nodded, his eyes welling up with tears. "Thank you," he said. It's all gone. Everything." "Can you tell me where you were last night when the fire broke out?" Harding asked. "I was here, at home," Peterson said. "My wife and daughter were away visiting her mother. I was alone." "Did you hear anything unusual during the night?" Harding pressed. "No, nothing," Peterson said. "I'm a heavy sleeper. I didn't wake up until the phone rang. It was the police, telling me about the fire." "What do you think caused the fire, Mr. Peterson?" Harding asked, watching him closely. Peterson sighed. "I don't know," he said. "I always suspected the wiring in the store was faulty. It was an old building. I guess it finally gave out." "Did you have any insurance on the store, Mr. Peterson?" Harding asked, his voice casual. Peterson hesitated for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I had a policy. Enough to cover the inventory, I hope." "And were you up to date on your payments, Mr. Peterson?" Harding continued. "Yes, of course," Peterson said, his voice defensive. "I always paid my bills on time." Harding paused, his gaze fixed on Peterson's face. "Mr. Peterson," he said, "the fire chief noticed some unusual burn patterns at the scene. He suspects that an accelerant may have been used." Peterson's eyes widened. "An accelerant?" he repeated. "But, that's impossible. Why would anyone do that?" "That's what I'm trying to find out, Mr. Peterson," Harding said, his voice low. "That's what I'm trying to find out." He left Peterson's house, his mind racing. He knew that Peterson was hiding something. He just needed to figure out what it was. The next morning, Detective Harding returned to the scene of the fire. The yellow tape still cordoned off the area, but the activity had died down. Only a few investigators remained, sifting through the debris. Harding walked slowly around the perimeter, his senses on high alert. He focused on the details, the small things that others might miss. The way the wind was blowing, the angle of the sun, the subtle shifts in the air pressure. He was trying to reconstruct the events of that night, to put himself in the shoes of whoever had started the fire. He approached a section of wall that had been particularly heavily damaged. The wood was charred black, and the paint was peeling off in strips. He ran his hand along the surface, feeling the texture of the burned material. Suddenly, he caught a faint whiff of something unusual. It was a subtle odor, almost undetectable, but it was there. A faint, lingering smell of gasoline. He knelt down, bringing his nose closer to the wall. The smell was stronger now, unmistakable. Gasoline. Someone had definitely used an accelerant to start this fire. He stood up, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. He noticed a small puddle of water on the ground, left over from the firefighters' efforts. He knelt down again, examining the puddle closely. There was a faint sheen on the surface, an oily residue. He dipped his finger into the puddle and brought it to his nose. The smell of gasoline was even stronger here. This was definitely the source. He called over one of the investigators. "I want you to take a sample of this water," he said, pointing to the puddle. "And I want you to analyze the soil around this area. I want to know exactly what kind of accelerant was used." The investigator nodded and took the sample. Harding continued to examine the area, his mind racing. He was starting to get a clearer picture of what had happened that night. Someone had deliberately spread gasoline around the store and then set it on fire. But who? And why? He walked back to his car, his thoughts consumed by the case. He knew that he was getting closer to the truth. He could feel it in his gut. He just needed to find the missing piece of the puzzle. As he drove away from the scene, he made a mental note to revisit Mr. Peterson's alibi. Something about his story just didn't add up. He knew that Peterson was hiding something, and Harding was determined to find out what it was. The faint smell of gasoline lingered in his nostrils, a constant reminder of the crime that had been committed. Before the fire, Mr. Peterson's life was a slow, agonizing slide into financial ruin. The weight of his grandfather's legacy, the failing collectibles shop, pressed down on him like a physical burden. He'd wake up each morning with a knot in his stomach, dreading the day ahead. He remembered the first loan rejection. The bank manager, a man with a practiced smile and cold eyes, had politely explained that Mr. Peterson's business didn't meet their criteria. He needed more collateral, a stronger cash flow, a more viable business plan. Mr. Peterson had left the bank feeling defeated, his hopes dashed. He tried another bank, and then another. Each time, the same result. He was a bad risk, a sinking ship. The loan officers were sympathetic, but their hands were tied. The regulations were strict, the economy was uncertain. The bills piled up, unopened, on his kitchen table. The electricity bill, the water bill, the phone bill. Each one a reminder of his failure. He started cutting corners, turning off lights, taking shorter showers, eating cheaper food. But it wasn't enough. The stress took its toll on his marriage. He and his wife, Sarah, began to argue more frequently. She worried about their daughter, Emily, and their future. He tried to reassure her, but his words rang hollow, even to his own ears. He started having nightmares. He would dream of the shop engulfed in flames, the collectibles melting and burning, his grandfather's ghost watching him with disappointment. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the smell of smoke lingering in his nostrils. One evening, after another particularly bad day at the store, he sat alone in his living room, staring into the darkness. The idea that had flickered in his mind before, the desperate, unthinkable idea, resurfaced with a vengeance. It was a way out, a way to escape the crushing weight of his debt. It was wrong, he knew that, but he was running out of options. He thought of Sarah and Emily, of their future. He couldn't let them suffer because of his failure. He needed to protect them, to provide for them. The insurance money would be enough to pay off the mortgage, to start over. He wrestled with his conscience, torn between right and wrong. But the desperation, the fear, the need to protect his family, finally won out. He made a decision, a fateful decision that would change his life forever. He knew what he had to do. The dark idea, once a fleeting thought, had now become a plan. A dangerous, desperate plan. The forensics report arrived on Detective Harding's desk the following morning. He scanned it quickly, his eyes searching for the key details. The results were conclusive. Multiple samples taken from the scene tested positive for gasoline, the report stated. The concentration of gasoline was particularly high in the area near the back wall and in the puddle of water identified by Detective Harding. The report also confirmed the presence of gasoline residue on the vintage toy car. The paint blistering on the toy car is consistent with exposure to a high concentration of gasoline fumes, the report concluded. Harding leaned back in his chair, a grim expression on his face. The evidence was mounting. There was no doubt in his mind now. The fire at Peterson's Collectibles was arson. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for the police station. "Get me a warrant to search Mr. Peterson's house," he said. "I want every inch of that place searched. I want to find any evidence that links him to the fire." While he waited for the warrant to be approved, Harding reviewed the case file. He reread the transcript of his interview with Mr. Peterson, paying close attention to his answers and his demeanor. He noticed several inconsistencies in Peterson's story, small details that didn't quite add up. Peterson had claimed that he was a heavy sleeper and hadn't heard anything unusual during the night of the fire. But Harding knew that the fire had been raging for hours before the first firefighters arrived. It was hard to believe that someone could sleep through all that noise and commotion. Peterson had also claimed that the wiring in the store was faulty and that he suspected it would eventually cause a fire. But Harding had spoken with the electrician who had inspected the store's wiring just a few months earlier. The electrician had told him that the wiring was old but generally in good condition. He hadn't seen any signs of potential problems. The more Harding learned about the case, the more convinced he became that Mr. Peterson was the one who had started the fire. He had the motive, the opportunity, and now, the evidence. All he needed was the final piece of the puzzle to put him behind bars. He looked out of his office window at the city skyline, the early morning sun glinting off the buildings. He knew that today was the day he would finally crack this case. Justice would be served. The arsonist would be brought to justice. With the search warrant in hand, Detective Harding and a team of officers arrived at Mr. Peterson's house. The sun was shining brightly, but the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Harding knocked on the door, and after a moment, Mr. Peterson answered, his face a mask of apprehension. "Mr. Peterson," Harding said, his voice firm. "We have a warrant to search your premises. Please step aside." Peterson's face paled even further, but he complied, allowing the officers to enter. The team quickly fanned out, searching every room, every drawer, every closet. Harding watched Peterson closely, observing his every move. Peterson paced nervously, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He kept glancing around the room, as if expecting something to jump out and incriminate him. As the search progressed, Harding noticed something odd. Peterson seemed particularly anxious about the garage. He kept trying to steer the officers away from it, making excuses about it being cluttered and disorganized. Harding's suspicion was piqued. He approached Peterson. "Mr. Peterson," he said, "what's in the garage?" Peterson hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. "Nothing," he stammered. "Just old tools and junk." "I'd like to see for myself," Harding said, his voice unwavering. Peterson reluctantly led Harding to the garage. The door was slightly ajar, and Harding could see that it was indeed cluttered, filled with boxes, tools, and various household items. As they stepped inside, Harding noticed a faint odor in the air. It was the same smell he had detected at the scene of the fire. Gasoline. He scanned the garage, his eyes searching for the source of the smell. He noticed a pair of rubber boots sitting in the corner, covered in mud and grime. He picked them up, examining them closely. "These boots look like they've been through a lot," Harding said, his voice casual. "Have you been doing any yard work lately, Mr. Peterson?" Peterson swallowed hard. "No," he said. "Not really." Harding continued to examine the boots. He noticed a small stain on the sole, a dark, oily residue. He brought the boots to his nose and inhaled deeply. The smell of gasoline was unmistakable. He looked up at Peterson, his eyes narrowed. "Mr. Peterson," he said, "where were you wearing these boots the night of the fire?" Peterson's face crumbled. He knew he was caught. He had tried to hide the evidence, but it was no use. Detective Harding was too smart, too observant. The game was up. I don't know," Peterson stammered, his voice trembling. "I might have warned them to take out the trash. It was raining that night, you know." "Raining?" Harding raised an eyebrow. "I don't recall any rain that night, Mr. Peterson." "Do you, Officer Miller?" He glanced at one of the officers standing nearby. "No, sir," Officer Miller replied. "It was a clear night, as I recall." Peterson's face flushed. He was trapped, his lies unraveling around him. He looked down at the floor, avoiding Harding's gaze. "Those boots, Mr. Peterson," Harding continued, his voice low and steady. "They smell strongly of gasoline. Can you explain that?" Peterson remained silent, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew that he couldn't lie his way out of this. The evidence was overwhelming. "All right, Mr. Peterson," Harding said. "I'm going to read you your rights." As Harding recited the Miranda rights, Peterson closed his eyes, his face etched with despair. He had made a terrible mistake, a decision that had cost him everything. His business, his reputation, his freedom. All gone, up in smoke. After reading Peterson his rights, Harding asked about his sneakers. "Mr. Peterson, what kind of shoes were you wearing inside the house that night?" Peterson hesitated. "Just sneakers," he mumbled. "Do you still have them?" Harding pressed. "No," Peterson said quickly. "I threw them away." "Threw them away?" Harding raised an eyebrow. "Why would you do that?" They got wet," Peterson said, his voice barely audible. "I spilled something on them. I don't remember what." Harding stared at Peterson, his eyes boring into him. He didn't believe a word of it. He knew that Peterson was lying, trying to cover his tracks. But Harding was determined to uncover the truth. "Mr. Peterson," Harding said, his voice firm. "I'm going to ask you one more time. Where are those sneakers?" Peterson remained silent, his lips sealed tight. He knew that if he told Harding the truth, it would be the final nail in his coffin. But he also knew that he couldn't keep lying forever. The truth would eventually come out. Harding sighed. "All right, Mr. Peterson," he said. "We're going to search your trash. If we find those sneakers, and if they smell of gasoline, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do." He signaled to the other officers, and they began to search the trash cans outside the house. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone knew that the sneakers were the key to unlocking the truth. The fate of Mr. Peterson hung in the balance. The officers rummaged through the trash cans, carefully sorting through the refuse. Discarded food wrappers, empty cans, junk mail, the typical contents of a household trash bin. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Harding watched Peterson, who stood silently, his face pale and drawn. After what seemed like an eternity, one of the officers called out. "Detective! I think I've found something." Harding rushed over to the trash can. The officer was holding a large, black garbage bag. He carefully opened it and peered inside. "There's a pair of shoes in here, sir," the officer said, his voice excited. "They look like sneakers." Harding reached into the bag and pulled out the shoes. They were a pair of old, worn-out sneakers, the kind that Peterson might have worn around the house. But these sneakers were different. They were partially melted, the soles warped and distorted. And they reeked of gasoline. Harding held the sneakers up for Peterson to see. "These your shoes, Mr. Peterson?" he asked, his voice cold and unwavering. Peterson's eyes widened in horror. He stared at the sneakers, his face a mask of despair. He knew that his lies were finally catching up with him. I don't know how those got there," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I swear, I don't know anything about this." "Don't insult my intelligence, Mr. Peterson," Harding said, his voice dripping with contempt. "These sneakers are covered in gasoline. They're partially melted. And they were found in your trash can. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what happened here." He turned to the other officers. "Take Mr. Peterson into custody," he said. "He's under arrest for arson." As the officers placed handcuffs on Peterson, he began to sob uncontrollably. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," he cried. "I just wanted to save my family." Harding watched as Peterson was led away, his head bowed in shame. He felt a pang of sympathy for the man, but he knew that he had done the right thing. Peterson had committed a serious crime, and he had to be held accountable for his actions. Back at the police station, Harding placed the melted sneakers on a table in the interrogation room. He stared at them for a long time, lost in thought. He knew that these sneakers were more than just evidence. They were a symbol of Peterson's desperation, his greed, and his ultimate downfall. They were a reminder of the destructive power of fire, and the devastating consequences of making the wrong choices. The case was closed, but the memory of Peterson's collectibles, now a pile of ash and rubble, would stay with him for a long time. The melted sneakers, reeking of gas, were a silent testament to a life gone wrong. The melted sneakers were taken to the police lab for further analysis. The lead technician, a meticulous woman named Sarah Jenkins, carefully examined the shoes under a powerful microscope. She collected samples of the residue and ran a series of tests. A few hours later, she delivered her report to Detective Harding. "The sneakers are heavily saturated with gasoline, Detective," she said. "The concentration is extremely high. There's also evidence of exposure to intense heat, which is consistent with the shoes being near a fire." She pointed to a series of graphs and charts. "These readings show that the gasoline is the same type that was found at the scene of the fire. There's no doubt about it. These sneakers were definitely used to spread gasoline." Harding nodded grimly. The evidence was irrefutable. Peterson was guilty. He decided to pay Peterson another visit in his jail cell. He found Peterson sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring blankly at the wall. He looked defeated, his spirit broken. "Mr. Peterson," Harding said, his voice neutral. "I have the lab report on the sneakers. They're covered in gasoline. The same gasoline that was used to start the fire at your store." Peterson didn't respond. He just continued to stare at the wall. "I know you did it, Mr. Peterson," Harding continued. "I know you set that fire. You were desperate, you were in debt, and you thought you could get away with it. But you made a mistake. You left those sneakers in the trash." Peterson finally turned to face Harding. His eyes were filled with tears. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I just wanted to save my family. I didn't know what else to do." "You could have asked for help, Mr. Peterson," Harding said. "You could have talked to someone. There were other options. But you chose to commit a crime. And now you have to pay the price." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "Tell me what happened, Mr. Peterson," he said. "Tell me the truth." Peterson hesitated for a moment, then he took a deep breath and began to speak. He told Harding everything. About his failing business, his mounting debts, his desperation to provide for his family. He told him about the dark idea that had taken root in his mind, and the fateful decision he had made to set the fire. He told him about spreading the gasoline around the store, and how he had accidentally splashed some on his shoes. He told him about throwing the sneakers away, hoping that no one would ever find them. As Peterson spoke, Harding listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He had heard countless confessions in his career, but this one was particularly heartbreaking. He knew that Peterson was a good man who had made a terrible mistake. But he also knew that justice had to be served. When Peterson finished his story, he looked up at Harding, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Please, detective," he said. "I'm not a bad person. I just made a mistake." Harding sighed. "I know you're not a bad person, Mr. Peterson," he said. "But you still have to face the consequences of your actions." He stood up and walked towards the door. "I'll see you in court," he said, and then he left the cell, leaving Peterson alone with his thoughts. News of Peterson's arrest spread quickly through the small town. People were shocked and saddened. They had known Peterson for years, and they couldn't believe that he was capable of such a thing. Sarah, Peterson's wife, was devastated. She had no idea that her husband was capable of arson. She had suspected that he was struggling financially, but she had never imagined that he would resort to such desperate measures. She visited him in jail, her eyes filled with tears. "Why, John? Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Peterson hung his head in shame. "I don't know," he said. "I just panicked. I didn't know what else to do. I was afraid of losing everything." "But you've already lost everything," Sarah said, her voice filled with anguish. "You've lost your business, your reputation, your freedom. And you've lost me." Peterson looked up at her, his eyes pleading for forgiveness. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he said. "I never meant to hurt you. I just wanted to protect you and Emily." Sarah shook her head, her heart breaking. "You didn't protect us, John," she said. "You destroyed us." She turned and walked away, leaving Peterson alone in his cell, his heart filled with regret. The trial was a somber affair. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence against Peterson, including the forensics report, the testimony of the fire chief, and Peterson's own confession. The defense argued that Peterson was a good man who had been driven to desperation by his financial circumstances. They pleaded for leniency, but it was no use. The jury found Peterson guilty of arson. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. As he was led away to begin his sentence, Peterson looked back at Sarah and Emily, who were sitting in the courtroom, their faces filled with sadness. He knew that he had let them down, and he would never forgive himself. Detective Harding watched as Peterson was taken away. He felt a sense of closure, but also a sense of sadness. He knew that Peterson was paying the price for his crime, but he also knew that the consequences of his actions would ripple through his family and his community for years to come. The case of the melted sneakers, reeking of gas, would forever be etched in his memory, a reminder of the dark side of human nature, and the devastating consequences of desperation. Justice had been served, but at a heavy price. Back in his office, Detective Harding sat at his desk, reviewing the case file one last time. He looked at the photos of Peterson's collectibles, now a burned-out shell. He thought about Mr. Peterson, sitting in his jail cell, his life in ruins. He knew that Peterson had made a terrible mistake, but he also knew that he was a human being, capable of remorse and regret. He wondered what would become of Sarah and Emily. They had lost everything, too. Their home, their security, their husband and father. He picked up the vintage toy car that he had found at the scene of the fire. He turned it over in his hand, examining the blistered paint. It was a small, insignificant object, but it had played a key role in solving the case. He thought about the chain of events that had led to this point. Peterson's failing business, his mounting debts, his desperation, his fateful decision to commit arson. It was a tragic story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of desperation. He sighed and placed the toy car back on his desk. He knew that he had done his job. He had solved the case, and he had brought the perpetrator to justice. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He thought about the root causes of the crime. The economic pressures that had driven Peterson to desperation, the lack of support for small business owners, the easy access to insurance fraud. These were complex issues that went beyond the scope of his investigation. He knew that solving individual crimes was important, but he also knew that it was just a small part of the bigger picture. He needed to address the underlying causes of crime, to create a society where people didn't feel driven to such desperate measures. He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the buildings. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to make a difference in the world. He knew that he couldn't solve all the problems of the world, but he could do his part. He could continue to investigate crimes, to bring perpetrators to justice, and to advocate for policies that would prevent crime from happening in the first place. He turned away from the window and walked back to his desk. He picked up the case file and closed it. The case of the melted sneakers, reeking of gas, was closed. But the fight against crime was far from over. He had a lot of work to do. The sun had set on this case, but a new day was dawning, bringing with it new challenges and new opportunities. He was ready. He was a detective, and he was determined to make a difference. The night of the fire, Peterson had driven to a gas station a few towns over, not wanting to be recognized. He filled a large gas can, trying to act casual, but his hands were shaking so badly he almost spilled it. He paid in cash, avoiding the security cameras as much as possible. Back at the store, under the cloak of darkness, he unlocked the front door. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creaking of the old building. He carried the gas can inside, his heart pounding in his chest. He started in the back of the store, near the electrical panel, the area he planned to blame for the accident. He poured the gasoline onto the floor, onto the shelves, onto the piles of old newspapers and magazines. The smell was overpowering, filling the air with a pungent, acrid odor. He worked quickly, methodically, trying to ignore the gnawing guilt in his stomach. He told himself that he was doing this for his family, that it was the only way out. But deep down, he knew that he was doing something terrible, something unforgivable. As he poured the gasoline, he accidentally splashed some on his shoes, his old sneakers. He cursed under his breath, wiping them with a rag, but the smell lingered. He knew that he had to get rid of those shoes. He finished spreading the gasoline, making sure to cover every inch of the store. He took a step back, admiring his handiwork. It was a scene of destruction, a tinderbox waiting to explode. He pulled out a lighter, his hand trembling. He flicked it open, and a small flame flickered to life. He hesitated for a moment, his conscience screaming at him to stop. But the desperation, the fear, the need to protect his family, overwhelmed him. He closed his eyes and dropped the lighter onto the gasoline-soaked floor. The flames erupted instantly, engulfing the store in a fiery inferno. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest, the heat of the flames scorching his back. He drove home, his mind racing, his body trembling. He threw the gas can into a dumpster a few blocks from his house. He took off his gasoline-soaked sneakers and stuffed them into a plastic bag. He knew that he had to get rid of them, but he couldn't bring himself to throw them away. Not yet. He showered, scrubbing his skin raw, trying to wash away the guilt and the smell of gasoline. He changed into clean clothes and tried to act normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that he was about to be caught. He lay in bed, unable to sleep, the images of the fire flashing through his mind. He knew that he had crossed a line, that he had committed a crime that could destroy his life. But he told himself that it was worth it, that he had done it for his family. He finally drifted off to sleep, but his dreams were filled with fire and destruction, with guilt and regret. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, and there was no escape. The smell of gasoline lingered in his nostrils, a constant reminder of the terrible thing he had done. In the courtroom, during the sentencing phase, Peterson was given a chance to speak. He stood before the judge, his voice barely audible. "I know what I did was wrong," he said, his eyes filled with tears. "I know that I deserve to be punished. I just want to say that I'm sorry. I'm sorry to my family, I'm sorry to the community, and I'm sorry to the court." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I just wanted to save my family. I was desperate, and I made a terrible mistake. I hope that someday, you can all forgive me." The judge listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He had heard countless apologies in his career, but something about Peterson seemed genuine. He cleared his throat and addressed Peterson. "Mr. Peterson," he said, "I have considered your words carefully. I recognize that you are a good man who made a terrible mistake. But the crime you committed was serious, and it had devastating consequences. I have a responsibility to uphold the law and to protect the community." He paused, his gaze hardening slightly. "Therefore, I am sentencing you to 5 years in prison. I hope that during your time in prison, you will reflect on your actions and find a way to make amends for the harm you have caused." He banged his gavel, signaling the end of the hearing. Peterson was led away, his head bowed in shame. Sarah and Emily watched as he disappeared, their faces filled with sadness. They knew that their lives would never be the same. Years passed. Peterson served his time in prison, working hard and keeping to himself. He took classes, read books, and wrote letters to Sarah and Emily. He tried to make the most of his time, to become a better person. When he was finally released, he was a changed man. He was humbled, remorseful, and determined to make amends for his past mistakes. He returned to his hometown, but he knew that he could never go back to his old life. He was a convicted felon, and he would always be viewed with suspicion and distrust. He found a job working at a local charity, helping people who were struggling with poverty and addiction. He dedicated his life to serving others, trying to make a positive impact on the community. He reconnected with Sarah and Emily, and slowly, painstakingly, he began to rebuild their relationship. It was a long and difficult process, but he was determined to earn their forgiveness and their trust. He knew that he would never fully escape the shadow of his past, but he was determined to live a life of honesty, integrity, and service. He had learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of desperation, and he was committed to helping others avoid the same fate. The melted sneakers, reeking of gas, would forever serve as a reminder of the terrible mistake he had made, and the long road to redemption that lay ahead. Detective Harding sat at his desk, reviewing the final report on the Peterson case. He closed the file, a sense of completion washing over him. He had solved the case, brought the perpetrator to justice, and helped to bring closure to the community. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. He had learned a lot about Mr. Peterson, about his struggles, his desperation, and his fateful decision to commit arson. But he still didn't fully understand what had driven him to such extreme measures. He decided to pay Sarah Peterson a visit. He found her at her new job, working as a waitress at a local diner. She looked tired and worn, but she greeted him with a polite smile. "Detective Harding," she said. "What can I do for you?" "I just wanted to check in on you, Sarah," Harding said. "To see how you're doing." Sarah sighed. "It's been tough," she said. "But we're getting by. Emily's doing well in school, and I'm working hard to make ends meet." "I know this must be difficult for you," Harding said. "But I want you to know that I admire your strength and resilience." Sarah smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said. "That means a lot." Harding paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm still trying to understand what happened, Sarah," he said. "What drove John to do what he did?" Sarah sighed again. "It was the store," she said. "He loved that store. It was his grandfather's legacy. But it was also a burden. He couldn't make it work. He tried everything, but it just kept failing. He was so worried about losing everything, she continued. He was afraid of disappointing his grandfather, of letting us down. He just couldn't see any other way out. Harding nodded slowly. He was starting to understand. It wasn't just about the money. It was about pride, about legacy, about the fear of failure. He was a good man, detective, Sarah said, her voice filled with emotion. He just made a terrible mistake. He let his desperation get the better of him. Harding reached out and took Sarah's hand. I know he was, Sarah, he said. And I know that he's paying the price for his mistake. He stood up to leave. Thank you for talking to me, Sarah, he said. It helped me to understand things a little better. Sarah smiled gratefully. Thank you for caring, detective, she said. It means the world to me. Harding left the diner, his mind filled with thoughts about Mr. Peterson, about Sarah, and about the complexities of human nature. He knew that the Peterson case would stay with him for a long time. It was a reminder that even good people can make terrible mistakes, and that the consequences of those mistakes can be devastating. But it was also a reminder of the importance of compassion, of understanding, and of forgiveness. The case of the melted sneakers, reeking of gas, had come to an end, but the lessons he had learned would stay with him forever. The fight against crime was not just about catching criminals. It was about understanding the root causes of crime, and about helping people to avoid the path of desperation and destruction. It was a long and difficult fight, but it was a fight worth fighting. He was a detective, and he was committed to making a difference, one case at a time. Time moved on. The charred remains of Peterson's collectibles were eventually torn down. In its place, a small park was built, a green space for the community to enjoy. A plaque was erected, commemorating the history of the store and the importance of supporting local businesses. Detective Harding would often visit the park, sitting on a bench and watching the children play. He would think about Mr. Peterson, about Sarah and Emily, and about the lessons he had learned from the case. He realized that crime was not just about bad people doing bad things. It was about broken systems, about economic inequality, about the lack of opportunity. It was about people making desperate choices when they felt like they had no other options. He became an advocate for change, speaking out against injustice and inequality. He worked with local organizations to support small businesses and to provide resources for people who were struggling financially. He never forgot the case of the melted sneakers, reeking of gas. It was a constant reminder of the human cost of crime, and the importance of fighting for a better world. One day, years after the Peterson case, Detective Harding received a letter. It was from Mr. Peterson. Dear Detective Harding, the letter began. I am writing to you from prison. I know that you probably don't want to hear from me, but I felt like I needed to reach out. I want to thank you for everything you did, the letter continued. I know that you were just doing your job, but you treated me with respect and compassion. You helped me to understand the gravity of my actions, and you gave me the strength to face the consequences. I am a changed man, the letter went on. I have learned a lot about myself and about the world. I am determined to make amends for my past mistakes. I hope that someday, I can earn your forgiveness. The letter ended with a simple message: thank you for everything. Sincerely, John Peterson. Detective Harding smiled, a tear trickled down his cheek. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, next to the vintage toy car. He knew that he would never forget John Peterson, or the case of the melted sneakers, reeking of gas. The new park stood as a testament to the resilience of the community, a symbol of hope and renewal. But it also served as a reminder of the dangers of desperation, and the importance of fighting for a more just and equitable world. And somewhere, in a prison cell, John Peterson was paying the price for his mistake, hoping for forgiveness, and dreaming of a better future. The melted sneakers, reeking of gas, were gone, but the memory of them would linger forever, a silent warning against the destructive power of desperation. One last time, Detective Harding visited the park. It was a crisp autumn evening, the leaves